Hello and welcome to the recorded study guide for the second quarterly assessment for your 8th grade United States history class. We're going to get started right away. We got a lot of terms on the study guide, a lot of information to cover, so let's just get going. The first thing on your study guide is life in the colonies. We're going to be talking about that on page 128. So we are starting in chapter 5, section 1. The main thing that you kind of need to look at is the differences between life in England and then life for these people when they move to the New World or America. You can see really three main differences. In America, there's more land, which means so more people can own land and more people can read. And this all leads to a larger middle class. And these two things right here lead to this. And that's really what you need to focus in on. These three main points that lead up to the Americas having a larger middle class, there's more land for people to, own and then have their own business or their own crops that they can grow and sell. They don't have to live under anybody else's rules, or they can, make their own way. The next thing I'm going to study is the Great Awakening. We look at two movements in this quarter. We talked about the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening can be found on page 131. When you look at the Great Awakening, you're talking about traveling ministers. It's a religious movement. Traveling ministers going from place to place. People preaching that people could break away from the past and start a new relationship with God. So that's really the whole idea behind the Great Awakening: breaking away from the past, starting a new relationship with God. Traveling ministers over here. This guy, who knows what he's saying. The Enlightenment is the next thing on your study guide. It's on page 132. The Enlightenment has to do with more science and human reason, saying that, there is a path to things, there is a process. If one thing doesn't work, find something else and try the new thing to see if that works. And what this does is, not only this process of human reason and methods to things and figuring out the best answer, it also introduces natural rights. And that is a big deal with John Locke, who is the next thing on your study guide, and he is on page 132 as well. This is John Locke right here. And when we talk about John Locke, we're obviously talking about natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and he would say that kings do not have the God-given right to rule. He would say that the people have the right to rule, and if a government is not protecting your natural rights, if the government isn't doing what they are supposed to do as far as giving everybody the right to live and be free and all this kind of stuff, then the people should actually kick out, get rid of, abolish the government. And that's the whole basis kind of for the Declaration of Independence, when we get into that a little bit later. But John Locke's ideas of natural rights, the Enlightenment ideas of human reason, all of those things lead to people questioning kind of is our leader really doing the best thing for us? Is our government really doing what we need them to do? Are they protecting our natural rights? And what we're going to see is a lot of Americans believe that the English are not protecting their natural rights, and they're going to want to change that government. But these English people have been building up their rights over the centuries. The first kind of document that we talk about with that is on page 137. It's the Magna Carta. It's a written kind of agreement between the king, and it protects some of the rights of the English nobles. It's one of the first documents that does that for the English people. And then as we get later on into history, some of those rights are taken away. We have King James here, who is in power. He takes away a lot of rights. So King James takes away a lot of rights, not only in the colonies, but or not only in England but also in the colonies. So Parliament, which is the lawmaking body of England. They decide that King James has got to go, and they don't like him, and they decide to ask William and Mary, who are these people right here, to be in power. So they kick James out. He runs away off into wherever he goes, and because he's probably going to get killed or he doesn't have any support, and they put William and Mary into place. So these two things, William and Mary and Glorious Revolution, go together. They are both going to be found on page 140. And it's this change. The Glorious Revolution is this change in power where William and Mary become the monarchs or the rulers of England. So they actually restore rights that King James took away, and it's nice for the people in England, and it's also nice for the people in the colonies, because what William and Mary do is they practice kind of salutary neglect, and that is on page 140 as well, towards the bottom. It is not a highlighted term, but it talks about stuff with salutary neglect at the bottom of this page. What we're looking at with this is that William and Mary decide, that they kind of have a hands-off approach with the colonies. The colonies have a lot of self-government, and they get used to that freedom. If you remember back, we kind of referred to it as if your parents say, hey, you can stay out as late as you want, you can do whatever you want, just check in with us once in a while, make sure you're not doing anything illegal or anything terrible like that. But other than that, you do what you want to do. You come home when you want to come home and stay out as late as you want. And then you would get used to that. You would get used to that freedom. And what ends up happening is later on we'll see that what would happen is if your parents just decided that they didn't want to do that anymore, and you had to be home at 6, and you had to be in bed, lights out, by 6 p.m. in the evening. And you would go from doing whatever you want, having all this freedom, deciding that you were going to stay up until who knows when, going wherever you wanted to, and to having really, really strict rules put on you and being in bed at 6. And that would cause a lot of conflict between you and your parents. And that's what's going to happen. With salutary neglect, the colonies are like the colonies get a lot of freedom. They can do whatever they want. They're responsible with it and everything like that. But they are self-governing. They are independent. And then all of a sudden, the parents are English, come in and they start giving a whole bunch of rules, and that's what causes a lot of conflict. The next thing on your study guide is the John Peter Zenger trial. We are going to be looking at that on page 141. John Peter Zenger, the main thing that you need to focus on is associating freedom of press with the John Peter Zenger trial. Basically, John Peter Zenger is printing criticisms of New York's governor. He's saying, the guy's taking bribes, he's a bad dude, which are all true things. They're all facts. He is taking bribes. He is a bad dude. He's very corrupt. But the governor doesn't like people talking bad about him. So he arrests John Peter Zenger and he puts him on trial, and he's going to, hang him for saying mean things, even though they're true. Well, in the trial, it's argued that he should be able to say the truth. He should be able to speak the truth. And Andrew Hamilton is actually the guy that is defending Zenger, and he's saying that as long as he's saying true things, he should be able to write them. If the governor is taking bribes, Peter Zenger should be able to write down that the governor is taking bribes, and everyone should be able to know about that. The thing that is illegal, the thing that you cannot do, is you cannot just make up things and put them in the newspaper. For example, like I've said before, John Peter Zenger can't just write down on a piece of paper and put it in the newspaper that the governor of New York likes to wake up in the middle of the night, dress up like a woman, and kill puppies. That's just not true, and that would tarnish the New York governor's image, and that's not true. So he can't just say that, but he can say true things that he has evidence of, that he's taking bribes, he is corrupt, and all that kind of stuff. So he wins. They decide that is the case. You can print true things in the newspaper, and that's where the freedom of press is established. So John Peter Zenger trial, always associate that with freedom of press. John Peter Zenger, freedom of press. moving on to the French and Indian War. This is not on your study guide specifically. The next thing on your study guide is the Albany Plan of Union, but the French and Indian War is chapter 5, section 3, and what we're looking at here is page 143 is where the section starts. One thing you need to focus in on about the French and Indian War is the cause of it, and if we look over to the left side of this map over here, we will see that, you know, the pink or purple area is the British colonies, the yellow is French territory, and the cause of this whole war is the conflict that has started when British fur traders move into French territory. They expand out into the French territory, this disputed area right here. So that's kind of the cause of it. French or English fur traders moving into French territory. During the war, there's a lot of specifics that happened during the war, obviously, but we're going to move on to the Albany Plan of Union, which is on 141. It's the first formal proposal to unite the colonies. It is made by this man right here, Benjamin Franklin. So, know that it is a plan to unite the colonies. Know that it is, it's all about that picture of like the snake, like the join or die thing. That's all about the Albany Plan of Union, joining together, being one unit, helping out each other, all that kind of stuff. You can't. The snake obviously can't function without one of its pieces, like it's gonna die. I mean, it's pretty obvious. But that's what that cartoon's all about, the Albany Plan of Union, and joining and working together. After the war, the English defeat the French and the Native Americans, and these are the post-war boundaries over here on the right. All of the purple pink is British. The French are almost completely kicked out of North America, and what the British gain is all of this land right here. This is what all these people have been fighting for, and all these people have died for. Their fathers, their sons, their brothers, they've all died fighting over that area of land. And what happens is, after the war, there's a whole bunch of conflicts with Native Americans, and the British are having to spend a lot of money protecting people from the Native Americans. And they say, well, we'll fix this. We'll just say, hey, don't go out there. You can't go out there. So they put in the Proclamation of 1763, which is on page 148. And this red line right here, now it's blue, is the Proclamation of 1763. It says that English people cannot move past this line into this territory that they fought for, and that makes them really, really angry. And they don't really want to listen to this. So what King George does, he's the King of England at the time, he's trying to enforce the Proclamation of 1763. So he sends 10,000 troops, 10,000 British troops to America to kind of guard the border, if you will, to protect this whole law, to enforce it, to make sure that no one breaks the law by moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that is when you see the Quartering Act come into place, where you have to house the troops, and that's because there's all these 10,000 troops. But the reason that there are 10,000 troops is because of the Proclamation of 1763. Through the Quartering Act is kind of like one of the first steps of the English doing things, or the Proclamation of 1763 really is the beginning of the English doing things to the Americans that the Americans just don't like. They are passing laws without the colonists' input. One of the first, acts that we talk about is the Quartering Act, and also the Stamp Act, which is chapter 6, section 1. It's on page 158. The Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress go hand in hand. The Stamp Act is taxing things. Everything's got to have, a stamp on it to make it legal, to show that you paid the tax. And the Stamp Act Congress is a group of Americans who come together, and they want to, protest the Stamp Act. It's like a meeting to where they can get together and decide how they're going to protest. And that's what the Stamp Act Congress is. The Stamp Act happens, the English put that into place, and then the Americans form the Stamp Act Congress, like the meeting place of people to protest the Stamp Act. Another set of acts is the next thing on your study guide. It is the Townshend Acts. It is on page 162. With these, we're taxing imports, glass, paper, tea, sugar, all, things like that. What you have to focus in on the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and all of these acts is that they are being passed by Parliament and not the colonists, which makes the colonists really, really angry. They say that Parliament, is 3,000 miles away, and they don't know what's best for us, and they're just wanting our money, and we don't have any representation, we don't have any say in these taxes. It's like I've said a whole bunch with the cell phone charger. Like if you woke up tomorrow morning and your cell phone charger is $5 to use it or unplug your phone, you'd be really mad because nobody asked you about this. Nobody told you this was going to happen. You just wake up and you can't use your cell phone unless you pay $5. That would make people really angry. So that's why the colonists are so angry. Nobody, they just wake up one morning and there's new taxes and they don't have any say and they don't like that. So what they try to do is they try to form a resistance to the British influence or the British, oppression. And to do that, they form these committees of correspondence, which are basically, they're on page 165, and it's basically to establish communication between different groups of colonies and different towns and things like that. What you will see is that these committees of correspondence will meet together, they'll decide things, and then that information will spread out to other committees of correspondence. So you'll have one group here, and then their information will go here, and then they'll spread the word over here and to over here and over here and over here, and then each of these people will then spread all of that information. All right, yeah, I'm going to stop drawing this because I think you understand. Maybe one more. Okay. So all of these little committees of correspondence would, then start saying, okay, well, we're going to do what they said to do. We're all going to work together. We're all going to, attack or protest or boycott or do whatever all together. And what we'll see is that these committees of correspondence then start, sending a representative or a delegate to a central location, and that's where we're going to see things like the Continental Congress. But that's a little bit later. So one of these protests that they set up would be the Boston Tea Party, and that is on page 166. I think this one's pretty easy. The Boston Tea Party, they're protesting the Tea Act. Tea, I mean, come on. So that's easy enough, I think, to remember. These people board the ships and they throw the stuff off the ships into the harbor, destroy a whole bunch of tea. The British get really angry. And this is obviously in Boston, and to punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party, the British put in the Intolerable Acts, and those can be found on page 170. Here's a list of what the Intolerable Acts did. It closed the port of Boston, took away their elected officials and banned town meetings. And, basically, the Intolerable Acts are meant to punish Boston, plain and simple, for the Boston Tea Party. And that's just, how it goes. The First Continental Congress is not on your study guide, so I wouldn't worry incredibly too much about it, but it's kind of the first meeting of representatives from all over the colonies to talk about, how we're going to protest or resist the British rule. They write the Olive Branch Petition. That doesn't get accepted, obviously, because olive branch is like peace, like, oh, hey, let's have some peace. Well, we obviously know that there's not any peace because there's a war. And to prove that, the next thing on your study guide is the battles of Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord can be found on page 173 through 174. Lexington is a battles of Lexington and Concord. The first battles of the Revolutionary War. And, it all starts out with, Paul Revere, who's on page 173, riding through his midnight ride, warning everybody the British are coming, the British are coming. The British leave. They leave Boston, which is right here, and they're trying to get to Lexington and Concord to destroy the weapons that the colonists are storing, and the British actually end up having to retreat and return all the way back to Boston, and we're going to see what happens after they have to return to Boston. But when we look at, we'll skip down to the Second Continental Congress. We'll get back to the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the Second Continental Congress is on page 178. Oh, red. That freaked me out. All right. The Second Continental Congress does a few things. Notably, it creates the Continental Army, and it puts George Washington in charge of that army. So, that's what you kind of need to know. It creates the Continental Army, and then they put George Washington in charge of the Continental Army. And that's the Second Continental Congress. So, getting back up this study guide to the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston, what you need to focus in on this one is, well, it's all on page 178 through 179, but what you need to really focus in on is how do the Americans get the British to leave Boston? And that has to do with taking the cannons from Ticonderoga, positioning them on a hill, and then firing them into Boston. That's the sound a cannon makes, apparently. So, they get up on the hills surrounding Boston, and they fire those cannons that they get from Ticonderoga into Boston, and then the English have to leave. Now, even though these things are happening, and some people are saying, hey, let's go to war, all this kind of stuff, some people are still not convinced. So Thomas Paine, and this would go under Common Sense on your study guide. This is on page 180. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, and what it is saying is it's basically saying that it's common sense. It makes sense that America is going to finish what they have started with this, these battles and everything, and that we need to go full force into this revolution, and it only makes sense, and it is, it is completely necessary, and it is our destiny to break away from the British. So, with that being written, more people kind of back the idea of breaking away, and then the Second Continental Congress gets together and they write the Declaration of Independence, which is on page 181. It's written by Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence, like we talked about a little bit earlier in the study guide, it's focusing on those natural rights, and if those rights are not protected, and if the government is not protecting those rights, then you need to put in a new government, and if that government doesn't protect your rights, you need to get rid of that one and put in a new one, and if that one doesn't, get rid of that one and put in a different one. So right now what is going on is the Americans are under the British control. They feel that the British are not protecting their natural rights, they are not treating them fairly, and they want to get rid of the British government, the British rule, and then put in their own. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is all about, and from here on out we're talking about the actual war. Alright, so now we move on to Chapter 7, and this is, Unit 5 now. Previously we've been talking about Unit 4. We are looking at Chapter 5, and looking at page 195 for the next thing on your study guide, which is Patriot, Loyalist, and Neutral. You need to know that the Patriots are for the Americans, the Loyalists are for the British, and the Neutral are for neither. And then the percentage of each of these, and that can all be found on page 195. I would also focus in on where each of these can be found, like where in the colonies. The Patriots were in New England, like the football team, and the Loyalists were more in the South and around the cities. So yeah, you need to focus in on all of those things. We are going to skip over privateer real quick. We'll get back to it though, and move on to the British Northern Strategy. And another way to look at this is that they are trying to cut off New England. So when we look at this British Northern Strategy, we're all about looking at page 199. What's their whole strategy here is that they want to take over the Hudson River, which is right here. Let me switch pens. Which is right here, and it will flow right here to Albany. They want to take over Albany so they can control the river, which effectively will cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So this is New England, and this is, the rest of the American colonies. By controlling the Hudson River, what the British hope is that nothing else can get farther. They believe that all the information that is fueling the revolution and all that kind of stuff, it's coming from New England. Well, what ends up happening is that, the Battle of Saratoga, these guys right here don't show up to Albany. Burgoyne is the only one that's marching down from the south. He is going to be fighting Horatio Gates here at Saratoga. And at the Battle of Saratoga, the Americans win. And, this is a big deal because this is kind of the first time that the Americans win anything. A real battle, anyway. Because before this, and if you go up on your study guide in the Continental Army, if you look at all of the problems that the Continental Army had on page 197, you will see that they were very inexperienced, untrained, and at first they were mostly made up of just kind of part-time volunteers, emergency volunteers. And to win a real battle at Saratoga, it's a big deal because it doesn't allow the British to cut off New England, but B, it shows that the Americans could actually win. And that is probably a bigger deal because when we look at the rest of the war, and this is why we call it a turning point, the battle at Saratoga showing that we can win, it brings in new allies for the Americans. And those allies specifically would be France and Spain. I would look at this. This is right at the beginning of section 2 of chapter 7. It's on page 205. And you just need to remember that France and Spain joined because of the Battle of Saratoga. It proves that they can win. Also, in section 2 of chapter 7, we're looking at pages 207 through 209 at Valley Forge. Valley Forge is where George Washington sets up his winter camp for his American troops. It is one of the greatest hardships that's ever faced by American troops because they do not have any money to pay for supplies. If we remember back, who created the Continental Army? Congress. And that means that Congress is responsible for supplying that army with blankets and food and all that kind of stuff. But as we've talked about a lot in my class, how does a government make its money? It makes its money off of taxes. And can this Congress collect taxes? They cannot. They cannot collect taxes, so therefore they can't make any money, and therefore they cannot supply the people at Valley Forge. So these people that are, marching to Valley Forge run out of shoes. Their shoes wear out, and, they get frostbite and cut off their legs, and, your percentage of living after you get your leg cut off in the middle of winter, in the middle of a forest in 1777 are very low. I mean, your chances of surviving the winter with both your legs are very low anyway, but with, getting one leg amputated in the middle of the woods, your chances drop even farther. So, almost 25% of the soldiers that go to Valley Forge die of not having enough food or, exposure, which means having being out in the elements too much and, just catching diseases. One positive thing does come out of Valley Forge. They get trained by foreign army officers like Baron von Steuben, which we have talked about. Moving on to the next thing on your study guide, which is George Rogers Clark. He can be found on page 209. George Rogers Clark is important because he helps to expand the war effort. And what he does is he marches down and attacks and takes over Kaskaskia. And what this does is it forces the British troops to spread out. That's a big deal because what I talk about, the way that I would think about it, and the way I talk about it in my class is if you ever made homemade pizza and you have like the ball of dough. So you start with a ball of dough in the middle. And if you have a big pan, you're trying to stretch the dough out to each of the corners and eat all of the sides. But what happens if you stretch the dough too fast or there's not enough dough to cover the size of the pan? What you do is you start stretching it out, and then you get big, thin spots and holes, and the weakest spots of the dough are where those holes and thin spots are, and eventually it might even tear and break, and it's going to make your pizza really bad. Well, that's the same thing with these troops. The British troops, they have a big chunk of British troops, the dough, and they're trying to spread them out all the way up to New England, and then all the way down to the south, and then also now all the way out to the Mississippi River and Cahokia, which is right by St. Louis. And, eventually you're going to get thin spots in your troops. You're not going to have enough people in enough places. And, that's why it's important to spread the word of the frontier, because out here in the frontier, the Americans have a lot of support, and the British do not. And, the Americans have enough people to, even if they're inexperienced, they have enough people out there to kind of fight the British. So that is George Rogers Clark. And now what we look at next is when the British moved the war to the south, and this can be found on page 213. And, when we look at the British moving the war to the south, you have to remember why. They really thought that there would be more Loyalists. They thought that there would be more Loyalists in the South. And after a while, with Nathaniel Greene here, he is leading the army after they kick out Horatio Gates at the Battle of Camden. He's leading the Americans, and he's kind of leading Cornwallis, who is this guy down here, which we'll talk about in just a second, but he's leading Cornwallis around the south, kind of wearing him out, and eventually meets up at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The Americans fight the British at this very traditional style battle, and they actually win, and Cornwallis is forced to retreat. And at the end of that retreat, they realized that this idea of more Loyalists being in the South and moving the war to the South to their advantage just didn't work. There just weren't as many Loyalists as they thought there would be. And so what happens is Cornwallis is forced to retreat back to Yorktown, and the Battle of Yorktown can be found on page 216. The reason that the Battle of Yorktown is significant is because it is the final battle of the Revolutionary War. And mainly the reason why it's the final battle is because Cornwallis backs himself up into a peninsula, and he's surrounded on all sides. The French blockade right here, so the British supply ships and reinforcements can't get in. They have to turn away. Washington can go in from right here and just attack and set up defense, or set up an offense right here to attack the British at Yorktown, just bombard them from the harbors and all this kind of stuff, and eventually they're just going to have to surrender, and that's what this picture is up here. This is the surrender of the British to Washington, and effectively the war is over. So the war is over and the Americans win. So after the war, there's a few things that you have to think about. First of all, the Americans are, about $27 million in debt, and they don't have any money to pay anything, so they instead have to try to pay their soldiers in land grant or land certificates. And that's fine, but you can't eat land certificates. I mean, you could, but it's not going to fill you up or do anything for you. So what these soldiers end up having to do is they have to sell this land anyway, just so they can eat, which, you know, kind of sucks for them. But that's what a land certificate is. Those can be found on page 223. When we look at why the British lost the war or why the Americans won, you really just need to look on page 218 for both of these and look at this chart right here, which is going to be on page 218. It's really going to outline, you know, kind of what happens to, you know, cause the Americans to have a whole bunch of strengths during the war and the British to have a whole bunch of weaknesses, obviously. But I would read through those and just know them. The Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ends the war. It's on page 225. It outlines, you know, specific points of what the British had to do and what the Americans had to do. The most important and most obvious is that the British had to recognize that the U.S. was an independent country, and that the British have to understand this. A few other things that you need to know about the Treaty of Paris are the boundaries. To the south is going to be Spanish Florida, right here. To the north is British Canada. And one thing about Canada is that a lot of the Loyalists that are living in the colonies, that's where most of them go. Most of the Loyalists after the war go to Canada. And the last thing is that the boundary to the west will be the Mississippi River. So the western boundary of the United States will be the Mississippi River. So you have Spanish Florida to the south, Canada to the north where most Loyalists go, and then to the west you have the Mississippi River. Alright, so that is the second QA recorded study guide. There will be an online study session tonight at 7:30, just like usual. The one thing that I will, say is that there are a lot of extra study resources, not just these videos. If you go to the website that you can locate, it's on the top of your study guide. You can find the calendars and all that kind of stuff there. But if you go to this right here, Quizlet Extra Study Help, you will find these nice, convenient electronic flashcards that you can go through. So, for example, Loyalists, you would know that it is a person who supported the British during the American Revolution. And then you would also know that Cities in South, that is the place where most Loyalists were from, or the area that they most were located in the United States. To get to the online study sessions, the easiest way, if you're on the website, is to click on the Facebook and Twitter tab, and you can like the page right there from this page. Follow the Twitter feed. You can tweet to us, and it'll take you right here to the Facebook page. Post things onto the wall, or timeline, if you will. And ask questions through there, answer questions through there. So there'll be poll questions and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, hopefully see you on there tonight. It's a good way to study. Yeah, good luck on the QA on Thursday. I'm sure you'll do fine if you've taken good notes during this video and you get online tonight and study, or ask any questions that you can ask us. And yeah, good luck and happy studying.